Greetings, fanboys and fangirls. Jared here with another review from Fanboys Forever. Today we're actually going to be having a look at an entire series of figures. It's the Ninja Elite Series of 6-inch figures from Playmates. This is based on the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics, but the truth about the figures is kind of complicated, and it's definitely going to be a different kind of review than we usually do. When I first saw these solicited, I was incredibly confused, but also my curiosity was really piqued. And it's all because these are quite obviously, and anybody who saw those original figures, the old Turtles Classics line that Playmates did way back in the day. I guess that line is 10 years old at this point, believe it or not. But these are reversionings, slight remolds in some spots, of those figures that were sort of more or less based on the original 1987 Turtles cartoon, but they have been repurposed here to be the comic book versions. First off, we'll look at the packaging very quickly. I actually really like the packaging. It definitely matches what we saw on the reissues of those 3 3/4 figures. And it just says Ninja Elite Series Raphael. All the packaging for all of them are exactly the same, aside from just the names being different on the front. On the side, we have some terrific comic book artwork. Love it. And on the back, we have a cool write-up about the Ninja Turtles. And, of course, the big reveal panel for all of them in that first issue. Of course, the packaging does have the probably unintentional effect of making it a little more obvious that these guys aren't really representative of what they're supposed to be. I do like all the comic panels in the back there. But once again, that also kind of hits the point home that, hey, these guys don't exactly look like what they should. So I think that it's great packaging. I just wish that that same kind of representation had gone into the figures as well. So as we go through the review, we'll be switching between Turtles figures as we look at specific aspects of the set as a whole. Of course, they're all practically the same figure. The only difference are the accessories and the heads, so we'll just focus on each one as we go. We'll start out with the leader of the team, Leonardo, and we'll just be talking about sculpting detail. So we can see that these are fairly basic bodies. They're certainly very kind of nondescript in terms of sculpted detail, just very smooth, almost animated, if you will. And of course, that's because these are indeed just the bodies and the heads and everything from those original cartoon figures that they did about 10 years ago. You can see that the shells are really a dead giveaway, that these are supposed to be like the original cartoon. Just the overall smoothness of everything else kind of lends itself to that. The one thing that they did change, sculpting-wise, is that now they created these new belt pieces, which are supposed to look more like they're tied together, I guess. And it's kind of funny. It's sort of an awkward sort of sculpt, really, for the tied portion on the front. It almost does look like these are wanting to come apart, like they're plugged in, and I guess they're just glued in there. So that one may need another dot or so of glue. But I'm sure that under this, there's just a big indentation because these aren't adjustable whatsoever. You can see that it's actually just sculpted into there. So it's not something you'd want to remove. There'd be no reason. The head sculpts are the same as they were in that original release, but there's a couple of differences. Now, the bandana is red, of course, to signify that these are the comic book figures. Of course, in the comics, the Turtles all wore red bandanas, and in the actual pages, it was black and white 90% of the time. So it was kind of a nightmare for me to figure out which turtle was which when I read some of those. But, here's something that I will say about the sculpting that I think a lot of people aren't being exactly fair about, is that I never thought that the actual head sculpts themselves were a good match for the cartoon versions that the original releases were intended to be. And they're actually probably a little bit better match for some versions of the comics. So I don't really mind that it's the same head. I'm not going to just dismiss it outright. It doesn't look half bad as a comic book Turtles head. However, if you look at the packaging, like we did earlier, you can see that they're going for a visual representation of the Turtles. This definitely is not representative of. This would be like later on in the comics when the Turtles look was a little more streamlined. But I'll tell you more than anything, this reminds me of the 2003 Turtles designs. So it is funny. It's almost as if this sculpting was like they were going to do 6-inch versions of those and never got off the ground or something. Everything else is very animated series turtles, especially with the front part of the shell being so smooth and everything, and just the kind of circular look of that and the back shell. So even though I don't think the sculpting is some kind of like dumpster fire or anything like that, I do think it is funny that it's kind of a mismatched effort where you kind of have the original cartoon body and a head that's more indicative of that 2003 4 Kids series. Next up, we have Michelangelo right here. You can see that, we'll just start with the head sculpt. You can see that the sculpting on his head is the same as that original cartoon figure release. I always thought it was kind of funny that they didn't have him smiling or anything in that release. As a matter of fact, he is the only turtle that isn't bearing any kind of teeth. So I always thought that was weird, definitely for the cartoon releases. But now in the context of a comic book figure, it makes a little more sense, and it's not so weird that way, because Michelangelo is, even though he's a little more lighthearted than the others, he's definitely not like the super prankster party dude that he was in the cartoon. So I definitely think that this is fine, and I kind of think it works for what it is. So it's not so bad. I do think the bandana is doing kind of a funny thing back here with the tassels. So still, it's interesting. The body is exactly the same as the other. So let's get into articulation. So we'll remove his nunchucks right here. We'll get into those here in a minute when we talk about accessories. The basic articulation for these guys really isn't all that bad, and I'll get right into it. The head goes up that much, down that much, and not really much side to side, but a little bit that it can hold, and that's it. And of course you can bring it all the way around, and that's it for the head. Moving on down to the arms, this is where things are a little funny. There's a hinge up here at the shoulder, but what you're seeing is about as close as I can get it down to the body of the figure. So you can see that's a pretty significant gap as it goes down. There's no way to bring it in closer, so that's a shame. You can get it to be pretty well a nice right angle right there, and you can even get it to go way beyond that because the hinge is through the entire shoulder. There is no stop to make the sculpt look better or anything. You can, of course, bring the arm all the way around with relative ease. Not much gets in the way. There is a swivel up there below the shoulder. There's actually a double-jointed elbow, which works really, really well. You can also see that there is a swivel there at the wrist. However, there doesn't appear to be any kind of hinge up here, at least none that I can sense anyway. We also have finger articulation on these guys, which is actually fairly nice. You can see that the fingers can do all sorts of things. You can actually get a pretty good grip, yet somehow it kind of has a hard time holding accessories still. Even the thumb has a hinge right there, and the thumb can swivel. So really, that's not too bad. There's also some generous diaphragm movement. You can go forward about this much, go back, not very much, but you know, a little bit. You can also do kind of a side-to-side motion as well. So this isn't so bad, but it does just kind of feel like there's just a ball joint in there, and it's just kind of just does whatever. There doesn't feel like a whole lot of control over that joint. Down here, you can see there's nothing at the waist, but if you just use the upper part of the chest, you can rotate him that way instead. But it looks kind of funny when you start doing like this, because yeah, it's all broke up right there, so you don't really want to do that too much, I wouldn't think. Down here at the midsection, you can see that he has a pretty good ability to do the splits, and that's not done with any kind of hinges or anything. Apparently it's just 2 ball joints in there. So that's pretty good just for that kind of articulation. We can see that he can go out all the way and get some really high kicks, but you can see that it has to kind of work its way around the bottom part of the shell here. So it ends up just kind of kicking out into a split. Here we have a thigh cut right here, and that works fairly well. You can also see that we do have double joints right here at the legs, and it is a really good double joint. So I am impressed with the double joints on these guys, just like with the elbows, the knees work super well. We can also see that we have a hinge right here at the foot, and it works fairly well. It's actually pretty deep and pretty far back. And you can also get some rotation here. What it doesn't do is it doesn't do an ankle pivot. So you can't get it to go, you know, like this kind of movement. It won't do it. We can also see that we have individual toe articulation down here. So it works really well. You can even get them to curl inward and go up. So really, The articulation is really, really good in these guys. As a matter of fact, it's better in some ways than what you get from some of the other Collector's Turtles lines. So I do think the articulation is a strong point of these figures. Next one we'll be looking at is Donatello. That's right. So we have the scientist of the group here. Donatello is a great character, and I do think that the head sculpt is a little strange what they go with for him. It was certainly odd when these were like cartoon toys that he looks almost in some ways fairly vicious, and that's definitely not what I think of with Donatello. As a matter of fact, really, if if it were up to me, I would say he would probably have the most neutral face, and Michelangelo would be smiling. He certainly looks very aggressive, so it's just not the first thing I think of with Donatello. But it is a nice looking sculpt. It just reminds me more of the 2003 cartoon, if Donatello was super angry. Let's talk about accessories a little bit. We get the bow staff here, and it's really nice sculpting. I don't think it's any different than what we got with the previous release, but I do like the wood grain in there and the bandages being sculpted in. But it's a real shame that they didn't go to the trouble to paint this middle portion white. Lord knows there's not much other paint going on this figure. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure any of it's paint, aside from the eyes. I think practically everything is some kind of piece. The eyes and the teeth are painted white, but other than that, I think practically everything else is just the color of the plastic. And so that's exactly 2 paint hits, because they don't even have to paint the pupils on these comic book releases. And you would think that they could have spared a little expense to paint some of the accessories. But you're going to see that that's a running theme. Now, another running theme with all these accessories is that they have sort of a hard time grasping them. Even though there's some really good hand articulation, it's just kind of a loose grip. You can try to squeeze on these and get the fingers to really grip and do what you can, and they're still going to have a little bit of a hard time. But this works fairly well. Usually, if I kind of move them around, if it gets jostled anyway, then, these things come out very easily. So that's one thing to be aware of. If you just do it one-handed, it becomes even more challenging as you're trying to get Donatello to hold the bow staff. It can be a real pain. But if you really clasp the thumb and the fingers together, you can get it pretty good. But just know that when you tip it over, it's just going to fall right through. So Michelangelo comes with these nunchucks, and they're definitely my favorite accessory because there's actual effort being put in here. These are actual metal links, chains on here on the nunchucks, and there's fine sculpting going on too with the handles. So I really like these. They actually have some decent weight to them. Since the nunchucks are a little thinner than the bow staff, he is able to grasp them a little bit tighter. So I think that works out pretty nicely. It's just the weight of this chain could make it a little more challenging to hold, but I actually think he holds it just fine. Next accessories we'll talk about are Leonardo's swords. Here's his katana blades. They're fine, but the lack of paint is perhaps the most obvious with the swords. And there's just nothing on the handles, and it's just flat gray. And so without there being any bandages being painted on the handles, it really makes things kind of rough looking. But what's maybe even worse, and it's hard to tell unless you see it in context of the figure, I do think that the katanas are ever so slightly short. I don't think it's by much. I think maybe it could have used 1/4 an inch more or half an inch more, and I think they would have looked a lot better. But I do think they're slightly short for this scale of figure. Also, keep in mind that there is no holsters or scabbard or anything for the sword because in the comics, he doesn't have like a strap to hold something like that for the original first issue. He does get it, though, fairly quickly in the comics. So that's something I kind of wish they just would have put on anyway, but I guess they were trying to be accurate to that original first appearance. And that brings us to our very last brother that we have not looked at thus far, and that's Raphael. And here he has his size. These are pretty decent, and as you can see, they have the same issue, though, as the katana, to where the bandages, the wood grain, whatever you want to say it is, isn't painted brown or anything like that. Everything is just flat gray. So these are okay. They're not quite as sharp, probably, as they should be, but of course that's a safety thing. They're probably a little long, honestly. Probably I could have done with them being a little bit shorter. So guys, all you had to do was just take the plastic away from this, give it to the katana, and you would have been good to go. The last accessories that you get are the base stands. Now, I will give them props on this because the other major turtle series right now from NECA and other companies don't include base stands. So these are actually really nice. I really do like that the comic book font and logo is right there, and then they have just Raphael, the name. So, and they work pretty well too. So you can see that we have holes in the feet. You just pop those on. It provides a nice, tight, secure fit right here. And they genuinely do help the figure stand very well. And they look really nice when you have them all in their stands together, like we saw at the beginning of the review. For Raphael, we'll be focusing on quality issues. And that's the last category of the review I really wanted to talk about. Definitely one area for these figures that I will compliment are how tough the materials do seem, because they really do seem like very strong plastic, very kind of well built. I didn't really think anything was going to break necessarily when I played with any of these guys or posed any of these guys. But there are a couple of other concerns. One concern is that some of the figures definitely have an issue to where some of the feet come off way too easily. Say, for instance, my Donatello here has that issue to where it's just way too easy to pull this out. That means that sometimes they're so loosely fitted into there that as you're trying to take the figure off of their display stand, one of the feet will actually be left on the display stand. So that's definitely a quality issue, and it was actually so bad on the first Raphael, yes, I said first Raphael that I got from an eBay seller, that I actually had to contact Playmates. And I will give them a whole lot of credit here because they actually contacted their own factory in China and actually mailed me direct from China a replacement. And it was pretty quick shipping too, so I do have to compliment Playmates on addressing that quality issue right there. Other than that, nothing really felt like it was going to break, but I will say that the fingers were very, very, very stuck when I first got these out of the packaging. So much so that I had to spend some time boiling the hands in water to make sure that those could get freed without breaking anything. But the finger joints were definitely very stuck. So other than that, the quality was actually pretty good for these guys. We'll do just a couple of quick comparisons. I do struggle to remember which one is which on these guys because unless they have their weapons with them, it's always kind of difficult for me. But I'd say that this is one of the most fair comparisons I could do, and it's just Playmates, just from the same company here. This was the 3 3/4 or 4-inch or 4.5 inch, whatever you want to call it, 2012 series version of the comic book Turtles that they did. Now, I would say also that this comparison is probably the one that hurts the most. The reason I say that is this. These guys got a reissue this year, and I talked about that when I was live streaming a little while back. Playmates knows exactly how to sculpt a really accurate, original first issue turtle. They just do. I mean, that sculpt is no slouch right there. It really does look like what it's trying to convey with a more significant nose, all the cross-hatching that they've done to look like old artwork, even going as far as to give us the comic-accurate tails that the turtles have. So it's not a matter of them not being able to do it. I think people have a real misconception about Playmates toys these days, and they saw too many rise of the TMNT figures and forgot that, yes, Playmates can actually produce really good detailed turtle sculpts like they used to in the 2012 series. But what I don't get is why wouldn't they just crank this guy up and upscale it and release these guys as a series and not do this, kind of strange recast, repaint, slight resculpt of those cartoon figures. That's just one little thing I'll bring up. Yes, it had to do it. Here they are. This is the Four Horsemen comic book turtles, and these, in my opinion, are still some of the greatest action figures ever produced. So I'm not exactly sure how fair it is that I'm bringing these guys up, but if you want to see in this scale what truly accurate comic book turtles might look like, these are the ones you would look at. And so if they're really going for that first appearance, first issue kind of vibe, this is probably closer to what it should have been. And I honestly thought that the 2012 series comic figures that Playmates did were very acceptable, kind of smaller scaled sort of versions of what these were going for back here. So it's a shame that couldn't be replicated in the larger 6-inch scale. I think that in this case, Shredder would be just tall enough for it to look okay, but the turtles almost seem too bulky to be in the right scale with Shredder, but I think it's decent. Here is one of the NECA movie figures, and they're not too different in scale, actually. Yeah, it's almost eye to eye, so it is quite funny. This makes this look more like a cartoon than anything I could possibly do. And one final comparison is Super 7's version of Raphael. And as you can see, this is much more the original toy. So I don't think anyone could seriously say that these guys are to the level of Turtles collector's figures that are being done by Super 7 or NECA in today's market. In 2021, the Turtles market has changed so much versus, say, 10 years ago when their original sculpts of these guys were released. Now there are just so many options. It's really insane. And it's kind of puzzling to me that Playmates would choose to release these at this time, or re-release these. It definitely feels more like an attempt by them to get something out, almost as a way to retain the license or something, because the truth is, at the time of recording, we just don't know anything about what they have, plans for Turtles. We don't know what the next iteration of it really looks like. We know that there is some sort of movie coming down the pipeline. So there's just a lot of uncertainty about the brand. The Turtles brand has been here many times before, and it's bounced back beautifully. So it's not something I'm really worried about necessarily, but it's definitely kind of a downtime for the Playmates Turtles brand. It's interesting to see these guys re-released, but I just don't think that they're as exciting as that box set that I talked about in the live stream. But this is one of those oddities that I was just dying to have because it was just so strange. Whenever toy companies do things like this and they repurpose something old and try to spruce it up, and maybe if it's even, I think, just it being inappropriate for what it's supposed to be, I don't know, that kind of does it for me. So these guys are fun for that reason, and I like them because I'm more of a Turtles completist, so I enjoy them, and I think that they're really good quality to the point to where you could give them to a little kid, and these things feel like they're indestructible, and they're made out of very heavy-duty plastic, but the artistry, the level of the sculpts and all that just is not where it should be compared to modern Turtles figures. I think the least they could have done for us would have been to have sculpted brand new comic book heads to put on these guys. I think that would have been the least they could have done, and they didn't pass that bar, so it is awfully strange. The other big thing that's holding these guys back is that these are comic book kind of shop figures. They're like PX previews kind of things, and they are $20 a piece, at least from what I can tell. Now, that's fine because we know that 6-7-inch figures, they kind of hover around $20. But the truth is that now your $20 for Turtles figures can buy you quite a bit more thanks to NECA, who keeps the figures, $20 to $25 or so, if you can find them, and that's the issue with those, of course. The availability is horrible. They're definitely cheaper than the Super 7 figures that are based on the toys, so they definitely have that going for them. And their articulation is a lot better than the Super 7 Turtles figures, and they have that going for them as well. The articulation on these guys is actually pretty nice, so that's definitely a compliment I can pay them. I think that $15 a piece would have been much more reasonable for what you get, and I definitely think that if you can find these more around that $15 mark a piece, then maybe that would be a good time to get them, but I can't really wholeheartedly suggest them for anyone except the most diehard Turtles completist like myself. Alright guys, well that'll do it for the review today. I hope you've enjoyed looking at this rather odd release from Playmates Toys, and I just really hope that they can kind of get things together, and hopefully the next iteration of the Turtles will be something that kind of connects to more audiences than Rise did. Of course, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming reviews that we have. Of course, there'll be plenty of Turtles reviews mixed into there as always. So guys, be safe out there, God bless you and yours, and I'll see you on Fanboys Forever. Fanboy out.